Hello, everyone. I'm Casey Loftman, Editor-in-Chief of Food Engineering Magazine. Joining me today is Dr. Mike Bentley, entomologist, National Pest Management Association, and we're going to be talking about pest control, specifically rodent control, during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Mike, thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Casey.
Yeah, and to get started, I know that your organization has seen an increase in pest problems, specifically rodent problems. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Can you give me a little bit of an overview of what are you seeing in terms of rodent populations, rat populations, things like that, with everything that's going on right now?
Certainly. So we are certainly in a very unique time. Given the changes in our behavior, we're seeing some really interesting changes in rodent and other pest behavior. Now that we're seeing in a situation in which the country itself is experiencing a shutdown and we're going into a self-isolation mode, we're seeing a huge reduction in the amount of potential food resources that rodents and other pests have come to rely on. Regular food waste and things like that are commonly produced and regularly provided outside of a structure in dumpsters, garbage cans, and things of that nature that are outside these businesses. What we're seeing is that there's a huge reduction in these food sources. And once you start to take away those regular food sources, we're seeing that these rodents and other pests have to travel farther and farther distances in order to find and have access to some of these regular food sources, which is causing some pretty interesting and erratic behaviors.
Okay, and you mentioned that they're having to travel farther. Is it, I'm thinking here that obviously food and beverage plants are still staying open and still producing right now. So those would seem to be kind of natural areas for these rodents to migrate to. Is that what you're seeing?
So I don't have firsthand knowledge of an increase in rodents moving from one location into maybe a food or beverage area, but what we do know from pest behaviors is that whenever you reduce a food source in one area, they're going to need to go find a regular food source in another. So if you have one business or location that is remaining open and other locations that typically would provide those regular food sources, such as, let's say, a restaurant or a facility that has a garbage can that's regularly full that no longer is full of food, those rodents are certainly going to need to find food in other areas. So if you have a business like a food facility or food manufacturing plant that is constantly producing food waste and other potential food resources, that could be a new source of nutrition and resources for these rodents for sure.
Okay, and then so what should these businesses that are staying open, how should they handle this? How should they respond to this?
That's a great question. We find ourselves in this very unique time, particularly from a pest control perspective. Many of the important control measures that we use for things like cockroaches and rodents involve the use of baits. And one of the things that makes these baits so effective is that the pests want to feed on them. In most cases, in a normal situation where we don't experience an entire country shutdown, we have a garbage can that represents a competing food source against that rodent bait or that cockroach bait. Well, now with this reduction in these competing food sources, while I'm not trying to paint a positive light with the current situation that we're in, it does present a very unique situation for the pest control industry and for food manufacturing facilities and other companies that are looking to manage these pest issues. Because now we have a reduction in potential competing food sources, which could mean that these baits are ultimately even more effective. So it provides us this very unique opportunity to be able to target and potentially gain the upper hand on some pest control measures that we've typically struggled with in the past. Rodents and cockroaches certainly being two of those pests that are a particular challenge when it comes to management.
It sounds like this might be a time to be more aggressive in your pest control procedures, and because, like you said, some of these tactics might be more effective now that they aren't competing against dumpsters from restaurants and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah. We would certainly expect to see some of these control measures, particularly those that involve the use of baits, to be potentially more effective in controlling these pests because they have no other food source but those baits to rely on. Especially in areas where dumpsters and things like that are no longer as regularly full as they are. Certainly there's other really important control measures that food manufacturing facilities should be that are most likely already implementing in their control process. Things like exclusion measures. Now is that time more than ever because of the situation in which we could potentially have pests like rodents traveling looking for alternative food sources because their regular food sources have been eliminated or reduced or removed. Situations in which rodents could be looking for entry points into a structure. So it is important now more than ever to ensure that every single doorway is properly equipped with an effective door sweep or some other device that prevents pest entry. Windows, other entry points are all effectively sealed up and controlled. Inspection and monitoring processes are ramped up and are certainly maintained right now, even with the social distancing guidelines that we have in place. It's still incredibly important to maintain those regular inspections, because in a situation in which we could have a reduction in pest in food resources for some of these pests, and certainly a reduction in human activity in some areas. Many of these pests look for those areas where you may not have as much human activity. So if a pest issue goes unnoticed and they happen to inhabit an area of a building that's no longer as active as it typically was, it could be even more damaging to a facility if a pest issue goes unnoticed for a longer period of time, allowing for those pest populations to ramp up and increase.
Right, and you mentioned something there that I want to explore a little bit more, which is not only do we have this reduction in food sources, but we have this reduction in people, in foot traffic and things like that. Thinking especially of urban areas where normally our sidewalks are packed and things like that. So, how much is that changing pest behavior as well? Or can you really say, okay, we're seeing pests moving out looking for more food sources, and they're becoming a little bit more bold because they know that there's not as much not as much foot traffic out there?
When pests are starved, we certainly see a change in behavior, and that's what we're seeing right now. Typically many of these pests, they make a living out of being cryptic. They don't want to be exposed because exposure means exposure to something like a predator. So they typically look for those dark areas with low foot traffic, nooks and crannies, cracks and crevices, alleyways, other potential travel areas where they can go where they're less likely to be discovered. But certainly we're seeing right now with the reduction in food sources, some of these rodents are getting desperate, and we're seeing that in these viral videos right now, such as those that have come out in New Orleans, where you see rodents are more regularly seen. The rodent sightings are starting to spike in those areas where more rodents are seen in the daytime out in the middle of these streets because they're traveling farther distances, even in the daylight, to look for these food sources. So we're certainly seeing that in some of these areas, pest issues may, especially pest sightings, may be increasing during the day.
So it's not so much an issue of they're not as scared as they were, it's that they're desperate and hungry. So therefore they're going to expand out into a larger area, kind of regardless of what else is going on.
That's likely to be the case, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, Mike, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. My thanks again to Dr. Mike Bentley, entomologist from the National Pest Management Association, and thank you to everyone for watching.